Thank you for joining me for a podcasting Q&A live session. I record these live on Mondays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. I'd love it if you would join me, and you can send your questions for podcasting to feedback@theaudacitytopodcast.com. A couple things to talk about today. One is where you should submit your podcast. The top places I think your podcast must be among all of the places that are possible. Two is Nick Owen has a question about the distinction between third-party and WordPress and where that fits in. And then three, Barbara has a question about some wanting some thoughts on certain pricings for a sponsor that they're looking at for their podcast. So if these things interest you, stick around. And also there will be other questions that may be asked during this thing because I'm recording this live over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/live. And if you have a question while you're watching, pop your question in over there in the comments, and I would be happy to help you with that during this live discussion. So starting off, first, there are literally hundreds of podcast apps and directories out there. So where is it most important for you to submit your podcast? Of all of the places, I think there are 6 places to be. And this list changes occasionally back and forth. And it's as you get to the bottom of this list, it doesn't matter so much the priority, but certainly on the top of this list are the most important ones. So let's see, 6 places I think your podcast should be. First, your website. It absolutely must be playable on your site so that your podcast is as simple as visit website, press play. If you don't have your own website or your own domain, get one. If it's even as simple as that domain points people to a separate website, so it's redirecting them, it's not ideal, but it's better than having nothing at all. So at a minimum, have your own domain. Make sure it points to somewhere where your podcast is playable. That way you don't have to tell people, find my podcast in iTunes. And iTunes, by the way, really old terminology to use that really hasn't been applicable for the last few years. That's why recently Apple has changed their branding to Apple Podcasts for the podcast app, since most people are now listening on their mobile devices, their iOS devices, so much more than listening through desktop iTunes. So that's why it really makes sense for this shift in branding, and we need to start saying Apple Podcasts, because some people may look at their phones and say, I don't have iTunes. Or, well, let's see, is iTunes on the phone? I forget if they even have it on the phone. Yes, iTunes Store is on the phone, but that's not where you subscribe to podcasts. So that's why it's really important for us to get that language correct. And that really leads into the number 2 place for your podcast to be is Apple Podcasts, or as we used to call it, iTunes. This is not only the number 1 podcast app and directory out there. So if you're not there, you don't have the potential to reach probably 60 or 70% of all of the podcast consumers out there. Most of your podcast consumption will happen through the Apple Podcast app, with iTunes being a little bit of that picture. But when you submit to Apple Podcasts through podcastconnect.com, then it puts you on Apple Podcasts. It also, by being in the Apple Podcast catalog, since Apple makes their directory available and searchable to other app developers, and they end up with this big API to power their catalogs, it means that when you get inside of Apple Podcasts, you're then inside of dozens of other podcast apps, like Overcast, for example. You don't have to submit your podcast to Overcast. If your podcast is in Apple Podcasts, then it will end up in the Overcast app as well. It may not be there right away, but it will be in there eventually, as well as some Android apps and other platform apps. So your website, Apple Podcasts. And then the third option is not really a directory per se, but it is something that you need to offer as an option for people to be able to subscribe to your podcast. And that is subscribeonandroid.com. This is, I think, one of the coolest things to happen in simplifying the process for people to subscribe to your podcast, in several years. I'd put this up there with the official podcast app from Apple in terms of importance and the potential for this. Because here's what happens. If someone comes to your podcast and they're using an Android device and all of the language on your site is saying subscribe in iTunes or subscribe in Apple Podcasts, that doesn't apply on an Android device. I think that someday Apple will offer a solution that works on Android, whether that's a standalone app or maybe something else, I don't know. But they'll probably offer something that works on Android. But still, it's not a seamless podcast experience, especially for those who want to subscribe. So that's where subscribe on Android comes in. You enter your RSS feed into that website. It gives you a little link back. That's a link that you can use on your website for those who are on Android devices. So what it does is when someone visits that subscribe on Android link, if they have one of more than a dozen podcast apps that are on this list, if they have one of them installed, then the link will launch that podcast directly to the podcast, your podcast, in that podcast app. If they don't have one of those apps installed, then it takes them to a landing page where it suggests those apps. And those are free apps as well as paid apps. So it's a great way for you to be able to get those Android listeners to subscribe to your podcast. And Android dominates the smartphone industry. Certainly the iPhone is among the most popular single model phones, but Android is far more saturated in the market. And there are Android phones running all versions of the operating system. It's very easy and inexpensive to get an Android smartphone. And you need to appeal to those people because the chances are the people who need to discover podcasts and haven't discovered them yet are probably using Android. And it's harder for them to get to a podcast, but you can make it easier with subscribeonandroid.com. Third place is Google Play Music. This is Google's official podcast directory and app. Unfortunately, it's only available to people in North America, both as users as well as for those podcasters who want to submit to Google Play Music. And while this is their official thing, it's really, really low on their priority list. Like so low that in the 2 years, more than 1 year, I think 18 months that it's been available, almost 18 months, they still don't provide certain things that they said they would provide. And it's still North America only. It's kind of ridiculous that they're so slow on developing it. And there is some theory out there that maybe Google will change course and put podcasts somewhere else in their whole ecosystem. Whatever the case, for now, get in Google Play Music. It's really important for you to be there. The fifth place for you to be in is TuneIn. And the reason to be in TuneIn is because of this little device right here, the Amazon Alexa device. And there, I just
Searching.
triggered
I don't
it.
see anything to connect.
Yes.
Check the device you'd like to use
Alexa, stop.
and make.
I'm new to this thing. But here's why TuneIn is so important. And I haven't installed any additional skills or apps onto the Amazon Alexa. This is new, refurbished technically, but this has not been customized extremely. So watch what happens when I say, Alexa, play the Audacity to podcast.
Getting the latest episode of the Audacity to podcast. Here it is from TuneIn.
The powerful independence of podcasting. Alexa, stop. So that was without installing a podcast app on the device. And she searches for my podcast based on the TuneIn directory. So that's why I think it's so important for you to get in there. It's because that means you are then natively available on the Alexa smart speaker devices. The sixth and final place I'd say is in the top of this list is Stitcher. Stitcher has really lost its popularity over the years, but it is still pretty high on the list of total app consumption. So Stitcher is a great place to submit your podcast. They no longer re-encode your media. They do now support giving you your stats and sending those downloads directly to your host, so you get to see those download stats in your regular download stats. So these 6 places are your website, Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Android.com, Google Play Music, TuneIn, and Stitcher. Those are the top places you should be. If you want to check out all of the other places your podcast could be, go over to podcastplaces.com. Now, Nick Owen asked the question, or here's his full question. He said, I don't understand the distinction you draw between third-party hosting platforms. On the one hand, a site like WordPress, on the other, let me read this again. I emphasized it incorrectly. I don't understand the distinction you draw between third-party hosting platforms on the one hand and a site like WordPress on the other. How is WordPress not considered a third-party vendor in this regard? Thanks for the question, Nick. The reason that I call certain things third-party, well, WordPress depends on how you're using WordPress, because there is WordPress.com. I would call that a third-party hosting site. And then there's WordPress.org, which is a downloadable, installable version of WordPress that you can host on your own server, whether that's a server you're running in your house, or it's a server you're renting somewhere, or it's shared hosting on a company like SiteGround, which is my preferred hosting provider. If you're interested in my affiliate link, by the way, it's theaudacitytopodcast.com/SiteGround. I call it third party if you don't have full control over it. So like WordPress.com, Blogger, Tumblr, Squarespace, even some of these one-stop hosting providers that give you an entire site and such, you don't have full control over how that site functions, what it does, maybe how it looks and such. So that's why I would call it third party. Whereas first party would be those things you do have full control over because you can change what it's doing. So if you're doing a self-hosted WordPress website, like you have SiteGround as your hosting, you're paying for a VPS or a dedicated server somewhere, then you can do whatever you want with that website. You can install WordPress, you can install something else. You can install whatever theme you want on that website, whatever plugins you want. You can have whatever design or functionality you want on that site. So it's fully in your control. Technically, it's hosted by someone other than you, yes, but you have control over it. So we can really get into the granular things of what defines third party versus first party, second party, and all of that. But when I speak about third-party hosting platforms, I'm talking about those that are some other place other than your own property. So I believe the context when this question was originally asked, I was talking about Libsyn, Blueberry, and such as third-party hosting platforms because they're hosting your media for you. You're not hosting it on your own website, and I recommend that. There are other kind of third-party vendors for websites like Squarespace, StudioPress sites, Rainmaker platform, Blogger, Tumblr, stuff like that. Those are third-party sites because they're hosting it for you and you don't have full control over how it's hosted. That's where I draw the line between third-party and your own control, or what we might call first-party. Barbara Carol Peters said, Hi, Daniel. I enjoyed reading all your answers regarding podcasting. Great information. My 2 sweet business partners and co-hosts and I produce a podcast for women 40 plus called Boom Goddess Radio. And we're about to price our first sponsor ad for skincare products. Yikes. So many different options for pricing. Let's say that based on your answers, we price it at $150 per episode. That podcast will be on the internet forever, basically. So does the sponsor get all future episodes of this podcast for just $150? Do we limit the amount of time that we run the podcast with her ad and then have to go back and reformat the podcast to remove her ad? That seems like a ton of work. Would love your thoughts. And if you'd like me to pose the question somewhere else, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much. Thank you, Barbara, for the question. This really is about how do you want to run the podcast and the ads. Typically, in the advertising space, you have either inserted or in a way programmatic or dynamic let's call them inserted ads, or let's call them dynamically inserted ads, is on one side. And on the other side are baked in ads. Now, the difference between those two things, a baked in ad would be if during the course of the conversation, you record that ad into the podcast. It's in there, it's in the context, you transitioned right into it from whatever you were talking about, and then you transition out of it. It's baked in. Yes, you could technically go in and remove it, but it's so baked in and it was recorded right during your flow that if you were to cut it out, it might sound like it was cut out. Or it might sound like something is missing, depending on your voice inflection and editing style and such. But for the most part, we would consider it baked in because it is essentially a permanent part of the episode. A dynamically inserted ad would be something where there's either a time code that you give or maybe a space or something where some system is then inserting an ad into your podcast for you. Now, that ad could be something that's produced by a company, by the advertiser. It could be something produced by you, and it could have its own little bumpers that go into it and come out of it. Like maybe you say, but before we move on, here's a word from our sponsor. And then you come back to the podcast. You can do things like that to kind of try and hide the fact that it's a dynamically inserted ad. But the point is that it is inserted by a system that has access and knows where to insert that ad inside of your episode. There are kind of hybrids between both of these where maybe you have a pre-produced ad, whether that be something that you recorded or the sponsor provided, and you, while you're editing your episode, you insert it into a particular spot. That's kind of baked in because you are the one inserting it and it's there in the file until you decide to remove it. Whereas a dynamically inserted ad would be something where no ad exists unless the system decides to add one to your episode in that place where you chose, and then it exists there for anyone who downloads an episode during a particular time. And then at some point, it's dynamically removed without your having to edit it. The system does that for you. So that's the other side. And that kind of ad could be, again, that could be something pre-produced, that could be pre-recorded by you, it could change in the future. So there are all of these things, and I know I'm confusing this issue a little bit probably for you. The main thing, when it comes to your own podcast, so you are going to do an ad for a company. Fantastic, by the way, that you got a sponsor. And when you price that episode, what are the limitations, the terms of that offer to the sponsor? That's really up to you to decide. At a minimum, I recommend that you let that ad stay in the episode for 3 months at a minimum, because that ensures it reaches its greatest reach. Because, well, typically your greatest reach for a podcast episode is when you're within your first week. That's when you'll see the majority of your downloads after you publish an episode. You'll still receive some downloads after that, depending on the popularity of the episode, its long-term value and such. And it varies depending on different podcasts as well as different industries. Like a sports podcast probably won't get downloaded much after it's released, weeks after it's released, because the content may not be as relevant, unless it's something like a general sports podcast where they're not talking about specific games, but they're talking about overall things or themes and such. So the most value for the sponsor is in that first month, because that's when the majority of people will hear and download that episode. What to do after its ideal saturation point is really up to you. And you did say in your email something about it seems like a lot of work to go back and reformat the podcast to remove their ad. And yes, it is a lot of work. So you don't have to do it. Now, this is the biggest value to podcast advertising and this is if you want to do it this way, and you can point this out to your potential sponsor, is that if you put an ad in an episode, you could say that ad will remain in the episode for forever. So if you have an episode that's timeless, and that's just as valuable today as it is 2 years from now or so, then for the sponsor, that means anytime someone downloads that episode, whether it be through a referral, maybe they're a new subscriber to the podcast and they go back and download old episodes, which many people do. I did that just recently. I subscribed to a new podcast, why did I subscribe to a new podcast? Because I have 93 unlistened to episodes in Overcast right now. And I subscribed to another podcast recently. Why? Because it interested me enough. The podcast, by the way, is my email marketing company is Active Campaign, and they have a podcast. And it's all about email marketing and such. It says all you need to know to fully automate your marketing and sales process with Active Campaign. So I wanted that information. So I subscribed to it and I downloaded all the past episodes. And a lot of people will do that. So if they do that with your podcast, they're downloading that old episode. It could also be that maybe a couple years from now, you realize, oh, that old episode is really timely because of something in particular that's happening in the news right now. So you share that episode, or you tell your listeners, hey, go back and listen to that old episode because you need to know that based on what's happening right now. So people go back and listen. Maybe through search engine optimization, that episode continues to receive new downloads. It could be all kinds of reasons for your old episodes to continue receiving downloads when those old episodes have timeless information in them. So, should that sponsor remain in the old episode? It's really up to you. If they do remain in the episode, then definitely tell them that they'll be in that episode, because that's a huge value to them to know, okay, you are guaranteeing this many downloads right now. And whether that's 100, 1,000, whatever the number is, just it's something that you know your episodes get this many downloads per episode. So that's something you're comfortable saying. I guarantee this episode and the ad in it will get 1,000 downloads. But I'd also like to tell you that we're not going to edit that ad out of the episode. And that episode will remain on our website with your ad in it for forever. So although we're guaranteeing and you're paying for 1,000 downloads or 1,000 impressions or whatever language you want to use, you can let them know it's very possible your episode could receive dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands more in the future. We've seen this even with a separate podcast on our own network. Beyond the To-Do List is a podcast on our network, and there have been certain guests on that network or certain guests on that podcast that have reshared past episodes. And by doing that, those episodes get more and more downloads. So for certain episodes, we guaranteed a certain number of downloads. And guess what? The episode now has twice as many downloads as we had guaranteed. And we didn't charge for that. And we could decide, okay, after a month, we're going to go back and remove that unless we want another sponsor. But like you said, it's a lot of work. So it's not something you have to do. It could be something that maybe you cover all your bases and you let your potential sponsor know. And this is the way we do it with our network, is that we say I forget our specific language, but it's something like the spot is guaranteed to remain in the episode for at least a year. And then I think we say something like, but we may choose to leave it in the episode indefinitely, or something like that. So they know there's that potential that it could be downloaded by hundreds or thousands of other people in the future. So if you price it at, for example, $150, like you're saying, it's up to you to decide what that includes. If you decide to edit it out later, that means you're going to have to do extra work. And you know what? It's work to stop earning money. But here's the really cool potential for your sponsor is a long-term relationship with every sponsor. Think about trying to move them toward a long-term relationship. See, if they know that a sponsorship from a year ago is still earning them money, and they see, wow, that was valuable, then they may be interested in renewing. Because yes, even though they might still earn from that episode from a year ago, it's not getting nearly as much traction as an episode today. that reaches a new audience, potentially, who didn't hear that old episode, or an audience that forgot about that old episode and that old sponsorship. They're being reminded about it today. So there's still value in renewing the sponsorship, not only in sponsoring one episode and then letting it remain for forever. So as much as possible, try to take care of your sponsors. This could be a whole nother thing, and I'm going to do a webinar with a special guest about this in the next couple months or so. It'll be a free webinar open to the public, and we'll be talking about how to take care of your sponsors and inspire renewals. There's a great guest I have lined up for this who has had the same sponsor for more than 10 years. They've taken really good care of their sponsor, and so their sponsor has taken really good care of them. Think in long-term relationships. So it's really up to you what terms you want to give on these sponsorships. But in general, unless it's this dynamic ad insertion thing, which gets into all kinds of other craziness, in general, the podcast ads usually stay in the podcast episodes. Over to the live chat, Scott Smith said, responding to those top places for your podcast to be, he said, we've had a few requests to put our audio-only podcast episodes on YouTube. I've noticed that other podcasts do this. Why would someone listen to an audio podcast on YouTube? That's what I think too. Why would someone listen to an audio podcast on YouTube? This is massively inspired by personal opinion, personal experience, and certain data that I've had access to. This does not mean this will apply to you in your particular case as well, but I'm about to get on my soapbox here. I'm getting on it right now. I call this stuff, when you put audio on YouTube, I call it fake video because it's not actually a video. Technically, okay, yes, it's a video that on their servers, but that's not the experience. So I call it a fake video. Whether that be you have your cover art in it, or maybe your cover art moves around, or you have some basic animation, waveform, anything like that. It's a fake video. This video you're watching right now is a talking head, so it's not as interesting as if I was showing things, switching cameras, multiple guests, special effects, lower thirds, stuff like that. But this is more like real video. So with these fake videos on YouTube, I've had access to stats that have shown certain videos that got tens of thousands of initial plays, or as YouTube would call them, views. And you look at the number in the video when you go to the video and you see that number of plays or number of views. It's a very impressive number. But it doesn't tell the whole truth. If you go into your YouTube stats, go under audience retention, and then look at the retention for those videos, and you'll see a completely different story. In this particular case, with this video, it had tens of thousands of, quote, views, unquote. The audience retention was depressing. It showed that within 90 seconds or so, I don't remember the exact numbers now, but within 90 seconds or so, 95% of the audience was gone. So those, even if with a number like 20,000, that means that only 1,000 remained out of that 20,000. Now you may still think, oh, 1,000, that's really good. But remember, that's 5% remaining. Within, I think, 2 or 3 minutes, it was down to only 2% were left. And within 5 minutes, on some of these videos, it was down to 1% remaining. So even of 20,000 people, 1% is 200. And then it starts to taper off near the end. And almost no one makes it to the end of a fake video, at least in the data I've had access to. So you may think, well, that still means I'm being exposed to these number of people. And search engine optimization. That's the big thing a lot of people tout, is to say, well, if you make your podcast available on YouTube, even if it's a fake video, that means you show up in search results. Maybe initially, but a couple things happen here. One is reputation and the other is ranking. So first, let's talk about reputation. With reputation, and we see it with this channel that we were experimenting with this on, the first video, 20, 30,000 views. Second video, 15,000. Third video, 10,000. the views were going down and down and down with each new video. And the reason for that, in my theory, is that people got accustomed to seeing, oh, this is fake video. I don't want to listen to something on YouTube. I want to watch something on YouTube. So when those fake videos would show up in search results, they would choose not to click on them. They would choose to unsubscribe from the channel when they realized the channel was only putting out fake videos. And so it was hurting the reputation of the channel, and people wouldn't pay attention anymore. So if that channel ever uploaded a real video in the future, most people would probably assume, who had seen the channel before, that, oh, this is another fake video. I'm not interested in that. And thus, the viewership would go down. The other aspect to this is ranking. And the way that YouTube ranking works, and this does make total sense for them to do it this way, is that they rank videos and channels not only based on views, but based on retention and engagement, which makes total sense. So if a video gets 10,000 views, but only 1% watch it beyond the first 5 minutes, and no one clicks like, no one subscribes after watching anything like that, then YouTube will realize, oh, there's something about this video people don't like. Let's stop giving that video high ranking. On the flip side, if there's a video that has only 1,000 views, but those 1,000 people, or a large majority of those 1,000 people, watch the video all the way through, they click the like, they comment, they subscribe, they share the video, YouTube sees that as, oh, people really like this video. So we need to rank this one higher. Because of these algorithms going in, they're seeing one video people really like and stick around for. The other video, people don't like. They're not sticking around for it. So let's rank the one people like higher than the one people don't like. Because all of these search engines are always trying to be more human-like and give the kind of results that humans actually want. So if you're making fake video, which has a very low audience retention rate, then it's much more likely that people will abandon the video, meaning that eventually your videos are going to rank below other things. So while it may seem great at first that, hey, you put this fake video up there and it shows up in YouTube searches, that rank is going to die eventually. And YouTube will then see that you have a whole channel with a history of videos that perform very poorly. And thus, when you do upload a video that actually matters, a true video, YouTube won't give it as much authority. You have to really fight hard against this stream of bad reputation you've created for your own channel. And so that new video may not get as much authority and ranking as it would have if you hadn't published all of those fake videos. Now, there is an accessibility aspect to this. Some people in certain countries or behind certain firewalls and such can access YouTube when they can't access certain podcast hosting companies. So there is that to consider. And some people, like Timothy McGowan right now in the chat room, said, I love talking head videos. Makes me feel more connected to the host, builds the relationship. This is a talking head video. We define that as what you're seeing is my head, pretty much only my head. And I'm talking. No special effects, no camera switches, anything like that. It's just a talking head video. That is more engaging than fake audio. So if at all possible, if you want to be on YouTube, try to at least make it a talking head video, because that is more interesting than the fake video stuff. Still, the retention rates that I see, at least from the data I've had access to, standard talking head video like what I'm doing right here, I see about a 50% drop off after a few minutes, but the majority of the audience, or a large portion of the audience, still sticks around until the end. Emily said about new shows, she said, I do the same thing. I binge a new show, then forget about it for weeks. Emily also said, I've heard people like the YouTube subtitles on the videos for the hearing impaired, but I don't know exactly how that works for people just uploading through Libsyn. The subtitles are an option that you can turn on either through YouTube, or if you upload a video to Facebook, this is also something that you can turn on, is automatic captioning or automatic subtitling. And it's for accessibility purposes, so for the hearing impaired, where they can't even hear your video to hear what you're saying. It's better than nothing, but there's a whole genre of comedy videos out there called Captions Fail. And some of these are hilarious too. And that kind of thing happens because YouTube will incorrectly caption something. So if you're going to enable one of these things, and you can do them very easily through the upload interface to enable it and then go back and edit those captions, I do recommend you go back and edit them because you'll find weird things happen. Like even just earlier when I was talking to my Amazon Echo here, in just a little test I was doing earlier today, I asked it to play the latest episode of the Audacity to podcast, and she played something completely different because the way that I said what I said, how quickly I said it, I'm going into the app right now to find my history to see what it thinks it heard. I am so new to this that I don't know where I'm looking. Conversations. Oh, it thought I said trust in dust. Somehow it got that from the Audacity to podcast, trust in dust. Interesting. But it misheard me. So you wouldn't want to see a transcript that says, listen to my podcast at trustindust.com. That's not my podcast. So check those things if you're going to use those subtitles and automatic captioning to make sure that they are set correctly for you. Last thing I want to talk about, unless other questions come up in the chat, I'm keeping an eye on it, is Amazon Prime Day starts, at the time of this recording, Amazon starts tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on Monday, July 10th. And Amazon Prime Day is July 11th, which is finally a prime number. So good job, Amazon, for figuring that out. This will be like a Black Friday or Cyber Monday on Amazon, and it's exclusive to Amazon Prime members. If you want more information about Prime Day and sign up even for a Prime trial membership, go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/Prime Day. But what I really want to tell you about is the opportunity to save some money on some cool podcasting stuff. I'll be keeping an eye all day on the Amazon Prime deals that come through and sharing those with my Podcasting Deals subscribers. So if you're interested in receiving those alerts, then go to the Audacity to Podcast, or no, go to podcastingdeals.com, and you can join the email list over there. And you can even say that you want to see only deals from the United States or deals from the United States and Canada, or your other selection of options over there. And that will then help filter those things out. So that way you can see only what you're interested in. That's at podcastingdeals.com. Typically, the deals drop things down by 20%. Last year, some of the cool deals that they had were these lights that I'm using right now, actually, which are Aperture HR672W and the S variety as well. The W is for wide, S is for spot. They had these on sale last year for 20% off, which is a massive discount. These lights are expensive, but those discounts made them affordable enough that I could switch from the big CFL lights that I was using to these smaller, more energy efficient, cooler in temperature, and more versatile in options, like with the remote control that I can control these lights. It allowed me to pick these up for 20% off of these things. And the other stuff too, like there were microphones and mixers and recorders and other things that were on sale, usually about 20% off. So if you want those podcasting deal alerts for Amazon Prime Day, make sure you're an Amazon Prime member to get these deals for Prime Day, because it is exclusive to Amazon Prime members. But even if you're on their 30-day trial, you can still get these deals and cancel your trial after you're finished. Go to podcastingdeals.com. Salman asked, I'm new to podcasting. I've heard that iTunes promotes all new podcasts when launched. Should I wait till I have a promotional strategy or just jump in and get uploading? Thanks for the question, Salman. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'll just go with that. Well, iTunes or Apple has the podcast app, which is the #1 podcast app out there. And they have this section called New and Noteworthy. But new and noteworthy is not the mythical unicorn magic. That's how I call it. It's not the mythical unicorn magic that a lot of people claim it to be. If your podcast gets in new and noteworthy, even on the front page of Apple Podcasts, it doesn't guarantee that you'll get a lot of subscribers. And if your podcast doesn't make it into new and noteworthy, it doesn't mean your podcast will fail and never build an audience. The thing about being in new and noteworthy is it does benefit people who have either reputation already or they're building on some kind of existing popularity. For example, if you're a fan of Harrison Ford and you go into iTunes and you see the Harrison Ford podcast hosted by the one and only Harrison Ford, that would interest you. You would recognize that and you might be interested to check it out. And if you're a fan of Harrison Ford, then you would definitely check that out because you recognize it. And you recognize it because he already has popularity in himself. And then once you listen to it, then you'd start to decide whether you're actually interested in staying subscribed, because it really depends on what he talks about, how he talks about things, the audio quality, and all of these kinds of factors that people use to decide on whether they'll stick around for a podcast. I've seen celebrities who have been like that flash in the pan, that they got massive attention when they launched their podcast, but because their podcast was so horrible, their celebrity status didn't carry them. And people abandoned the podcast because it was horrible. They didn't want to stick around for it, even though he was a celebrity. I've seen other people who've been nobodies succeed with their podcast without ever being featured inside of iTunes. So the other type of popularity that you could tap into is more timing based. So around the time of the elections, because a lot of people were unhappy with certain results or happy with certain results, or a lot of more people, if nothing else, what I think that the elections did, the 2016 elections did, is it got more people interested in American politics, especially Americans. I got them more interested, more engaged in American politics. And I think that's a fantastic thing for more people to care about what's going on in the government. We may not all agree, and we don't all agree. You may not agree with me. I may not agree with you. But what I love seeing is more people caring, more people getting engaged, more people going out to vote, understanding the issues and such. But that to say that around the time of the elections, a lot of podcasts were released that talked about the elections or talked about certain things about politics. And they did really well because they, in a sense, got lucky, but they were hitting on something at the right moment with the right message. TV show fan podcast. This is another example. If you launch a TV show fan podcast, when the TV show also launches, either very soon, or right on the same day it launches, or a little bit before or a little bit after. But if you can launch around the same time that the TV show launches, you're riding on that same popularity, especially in this day where many people know there are probably podcasts about their favorite TV shows. They might even go in the podcast app looking for podcasts about their favorite TV show, and they find yours because they're freshly interested in the TV show. So they find your podcast about the TV show. So you're riding the popularity of the TV show at that time. My Once Upon a Time podcast launched 3 months late after the Once Upon a Time TV show had launched, but we were still able to ride some of that popularity. Now, though, if we showed up, and Apple has refeatured our podcast in New and Noteworthy, so there's no truth to the idea that you can only be in New and Noteworthy during your first 8 weeks. That's completely false. But our podcast has been featured in New and Noteworthy on the front page of Apple before. And the second time was when the TV show was returning from a hiatus, and we got almost no bump in downloads or new subscriptions from that because the interest in the TV show had seriously diminished and people weren't as interested in checking out a podcast about this TV show that they weren't as interested in anymore. I'm thinking about launching a single season TV show fan podcast about a TV show that's coming out this fall, and that will probably get some attention. But that'll die out when the TV show dies, because I really think that TV show may not even make it completely through its first season, if it even makes it that far. And when I'm ready to announce what that is, you'll hear me talk about it. So to your question, should I wait till I have a promotional strategy or just jump in and get uploading? It's really both. You should have a promotional strategy, but that promotional strategy should not be dependent on Apple. You should promote your podcast as if Apple will do nothing for you. So still have a strategy, and that strategy needs to be to get people to subscribe. The ratings and reviews stuff, people say, oh, you need to get a whole lot of ratings and reviews when you first launch. No, you don't. You look in iTunes right now. In fact, okay, I have not looked at the iTunes front page podcast New and Noteworthy for a while. So this is completely new, fresh perspective, untainted. Right now, looking at some of the podcasts in iTunes, I see one that has 106 ratings and reviews, one that has no ratings and reviews, one that, and now Apple would be slow, one that has 384 ratings and reviews, one that has 303 ratings and reviews, one that has, again, no ratings and reviews. Here's another one that has about a dozen ratings and reviews. I'm clicking randomly inside of this one that has 19 ratings and reviews, and it's not even full 4 stars. It's like 3.5 stars. So the ratings and reviews can look cool, but they don't help you show up in that feature. So you don't have to get ratings and reviews. What's most important is just get subscribers. Convince people why they should subscribe. So a launch strategy or promotion strategy, yeah, certainly get into it, but don't let that hold you back from launching. Try to get the right people interested in your podcast, and that will help you so much more than trying to get in this mythical unicorn magic of iTunes New and Noteworthy, because that just may not help you unless you happen to have something that people want right now, today, and they're looking for your kind of content, and boom, there it is. It won't help you as much as going out and finding your ideal audience. So a good promotional strategy is launch with a few episodes, not for any reason of getting featured, but the reason I say to launch with a few episodes is, for one, workflow, so that you have less work to do when you're trying to promote everything and get people excited about your new podcast, promoting all of these places. You don't have to focus so much on producing the next episode. You're a few episodes ahead. Also, for the consumer, it means that when they find your podcast, there's not only the one episode, they have a few episodes, so they can binge on it and get hooked on your podcast because they love the episodes that you've released. And like, I'm looking in Apple Podcasts right now, and the number of episodes that some of these different podcasts have. Some have, well, here's one that has 30 episodes, and it was launched in February, and it's in New and Noteworthy. So there goes that mythical 8-week thing. Here's one that has 14 episodes, one that has 9 episodes, one that has two episodes, with one of them being simply a trailer. So the number of episodes does not get you featured, but it's really nice if you can feed your audience and get them hooked at the beginning. I mean, think of, talking about feeding, think of when you go to those stores where they give you free samples. They want to give you enough that you're not full, but also enough that you get a good taste of the product. So that might be a single bite. They don't give you this like grain of rice sized sample, because that's not enough for you to really get a good taste of that thing. So for your podcast, I recommend launch with about 3 or so episodes, 3 to 5. If you can't do that, it's totally okay. Launch with what you can, promote the podcast, go in front of your ideal audience, but don't let trying to perfect a strategy hold you back from launching, because the world might need your message. So the longer that you delay launching, the longer you're making the world wait for the message that they might need to hear. So I've given a lot of information today. If you want podcasting deal alerts, go over to podcastingdeals.com and cool stuff will be coming. I have to be careful that I don't spend too much money, and I hope that you don't spend too much money on any of these deals for Amazon Prime Day as well. And those deal alerts, by the way, continue throughout the year. So if I see any other good deal that I think is relative or relevant to podcasters, then I share that out as well. So especially around the holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, you'll see a lot of deal alerts come around then, but there might be something throughout the year that maybe a particular microphone goes on sale, 20, 30, 50% off, whatever. But certainly whenever the ATR 2100 drops to a pretty low price, I send out a deal alert about that. Or the webcam, like the webcam I'm using right now, a Logitech C920 webcam. When that goes on a really good price, I send out an alert about that. So if you join that list, you'll get deals throughout the year, just whenever they're relevant. And those deal alerts start just right away or whenever there's a new deal. And it's one deal per email, basically. So go to podcastingdeals.com to get those deal alerts to you. The next episode of the Audacity to Podcast over at theaudacitytopodcast.com will be about how you can get press access for your podcast. So whether you've been trying to get access to be able to review things, like see movies ahead of time, get products that you can try out for free to be able to talk about on your podcast, or press access to conferences or events, this podcast episode will help you with some tips so you can get press access for your podcast and with the power of your podcast. That's coming out on July 11th at theaudacitytopodcast.com. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for watching.